Good morning, everybody. How are we doing today? It's Thursday morning. It's been kind of a slow week in the coffee shop cafe. We got some snow Tuesday and a Wednesday, which in Minnesota shouldn't be a regular thing, but this winter's been anything but regular. It's we're supposed to be back up near 70 by Sunday, and then the 50s again today. So this snow is going to be all gone by sundown tonight. We only got a couple inches. It wasn't much either. It was cold and blustery. It got down to 25, 17 degrees at night, I think. But I mean, we got some normal Minnesota weather for a couple of days, and we got like 6, 7 days of it in January. But for the most part, winter has not really shown up this year. It's been kind of an extended fall. I need to once again ask for people to help donate money to the coffee shop right now. I had a tenant in the basement that was paying some rent, helping out with the mortgage, and he flew the coop on me. He lost his job. He was supposed to go on unemployment, but instead he just disappeared. And I got confirmation yesterday that he's up in central Minnesota now, a couple, 3 hours away, looking for work at his child's place, his son's place. This guy was in his 50s like me. And he's not going to give me nothing. So, and once again, I'm in a financial bind. And you guys have been a blessing. A lot of you have helped me out here. $50, $100, whatever you can do. Even $5, $10, $20 through Patreon. But it's better right now if you go into my PayPal, which is a link on the page there. So I get that money much quicker through PayPal. Anything you send through Super Thanks and YouTube, I only get that on my payouts, which happens whenever I hit a certain threshold, and it's like $600. And believe it or not, it takes a long time for YouTube to get me that much money through advertising. And so you can send me $100 through Super Thanks, and I won't see it for months. But any way you want to do it, it will be appreciated. Again, it's it's really not the point of this channel is to ask for money, but I do think this coffee shop and cafe is important. It's more than just a coffee shop. It's definitely a resource and a place for people to come and gather and share and talk about music, history, and the love of jazz. But I digress from that. I'm going to move on. A record I dove back into yesterday that I hadn't heard probably in 6 months, not jazz related, is Tears for Fears' newest record. And I'm a pretty big fan of Tears for Fears. I think their first record had a couple of great songs on it. And then Songs from the Big Chair, of course, is a seminal record of the 80s. Everyone Wants to Rule the World, Shout. Those songs were ubiquitous and everywhere. Even as a kid in Canada, I remember many times sitting there waiting for Motley Crue, Shout the Devil to come on. Instead, I got Tears for Fears, Shout, which at the time I wasn't very thrilled about. But of course, the Tears for Fears stuff has aged really well. And it's an incredible record. And without any hesitation, there's a great influence on Tears for Fears from the Beatles. Which, I think Roland Orzabal will be the first one to admit that. So in the Seeds of Love, that record had a lot of Beatles-esque stuff as well. The first one, The Hurting, was probably a little bit more alternative rock and a little bit more dark. But once you get to Big Chair and Seeds of Love and, of course, this latest record, The Tipping Point, it's really a record worth diving into. And the title song, The Tipping Point, is a beautiful song about loss and reckoning. And Roland lost his wife, who had an alcohol issue, and it made him kind of challenge himself and some of his own consumption and how he saw his enabling his wife and the guilt and the shame he felt from that. And I think that's also echoed in the first song on the second side, Rivers of Mercy. Drop me into rivers of mercy. He's pleading. And there's a desperation in his tone and a sense of a need for atonement and forgiveness. And it doesn't feel like a spiritual, in a religious kind of sense. It's much more of just the grief and the shame and the guilt of life and your own choices and how they are magnified in those around you. And now that she's passed, his reflections on that stuff has him struggling with his own mortal soul and his own conditions of life. And that's a jazz kind of correlation. Because jazz is the expression of life, and it's how we consume our daily activities and how it comes back out through that horn. And with Roland Orzabal, of course, and Kurt Smith's great as well, a great harmony singer, bass player. They're really a two-part team. But Roland really feels like the driving force on this record, especially, and I think he usually was. Uh, but there's a humility in his age, a wisdom, but also a great grief and sorrow. And Rivers of Mercy to me is one of the most beautiful songs I've ever heard. It's haunting, it's eloquent, it's pleading, it's desperate. It's really a timeless song that I think everyone can relate to. Long time, no small thing. I mean, there's a lot of really good songs on here, but Master Plan, which is the third song on side two, really jumped out at me yesterday. And boy, is that Beatlesque. Some of the harmony, some of the production, some of the arrangement, it just all felt very much influenced by John and Paul and that whole Beatle, George Martin sound, and even some of the harmonies and their approach to song construction. The Master Plan is definitely a very Beatle-like, and really you can't give a song higher praise than to reference the Beatles when you talk about their music. The Beatles are really the summit of production, the summit of song creation, and brilliant production. Things that never been thought of before, they did that all the time. Strings, backwards guitars, backwards vocals. I mean, it's just an endless stream. Mellotron, Eleanor Rigby. There's so many examples of things. Tomorrow Never Knows with that looping drum beat and the backwards guitar solo. There's so much things the Beatles did that hadn't really even been a thought before. That it's hard to hear now with the lens of everything that's happened in the last 50 years. But at that time in 64, 5, 6, 7, what they were doing was really unprecedented. And of course, without George Martin, none of it comes off the way it did. And I've said before, innovation's only as good as it is useful. You can innovate a steering wheel on top of a car, but that steering wheel's not going to do anybody any good. You can put a wheel up there, but that wheel's not going to catch you any more traction. I mean, so innovation can be just unnecessary and frivolous and unnecessary, I guess, kind of covers it. But when you could be innovative and invent new lanes of sound and composition, but make it still commercially acceptable and viable, and still have it be able for the masses to digest. That's really what innovation is magical. And that's part of what Monk was about. It's part of what Parker was about. It's part of what Ellington and Armstrong were about. They were very innovative, but they always made it accessible. They always made it something that it might strain at the boundaries and limitations of what came before, but now becomes a necessary part of what goes forward. And so great innovation in music and art probably in general, it's never forced or unnecessary. Once it happens, it feels like it becomes necessary. It feels like it became an absolutely essential part of that next chapter in music history. And the Beatles are that in spades. I've said many times that they're the ultimate bottleneck in music. Everything before the Beatles ends up in the Beatles sounds, from ragtime to the blues to early rock and roll to gospel music to jazz. It's all kind of being filtered into what John and Paul and even George and Ringo to some extent were doing. And then post Beatles, everything since then has Beatles in it, even if they don't know it. I mean, Helter Skelter was a huge influence on Ozzy Osbourne and Tony Iommi and Black Sabbath. Heavy metal kind of is, the genesis is Helter Skelter. Revolution number 9. Number 9. I mean, that's the innovation of industrial and noise and some of that weird music that comes later. I mean, Tomorrow Never Knows is the beginning of techno-electronic music. Loops and backwards sounds and things that were just driving and pulsing and that you could really fucking shake and get high to. The lyrical content of what John and Paul, especially John, George, some of his lyrics were very transcendental and meditative and exploring the realms of consciousness beyond just Western philosophy and Western theology and Western economics. They dove deeply into all the different fundamentals and sounds and aspects of what music was about. So the Beatles are at this incredibly important moment in history, and they even have jazz influence in a lot of their sound at times. But the Tears for Fears record is definitely something you should dig into. If you like pop and rock at all, and innovative song creation and great vocal harmonies and lyrics with some consciousness and some thought-provoking. I mean, there's some songs in there too, just with the times they're being made in the pandemic. It's a really thought-provoking, interesting record that I really highly recommend. We're gonna move on. I alluded to this last time about some Norman Granz, Verve, Clef stuff. And if you remember last, probably May or June, maybe even April, probably May, I bought 5 records from Italy. And I had problems with this guy once before, in terms of him taking 2 months to ship something. And apparently he travels a lot for work, but still, that's, if you run a business, you have to be more accountable than that. You need to respond better to emails. And I took the chance and bought some more from this guy because he had some stuff I wanted at a good price. We bundled some stuff together, and these records never showed up. And I waited for months and months and months, and I was trying to complete the Clef Norgran discography, and these records were big gaps because I'm like, I'm not going to buy them again because they're going to show up eventually, and they never did. And I finally made an episode about it, probably last October, November, and I kind of blasted the seller, and he still hasn't responded. He still hasn't issued a refund. I think it's Cosmic Daddy on Discogs. This guy is completely been unaccountable. There's no tracking, and I mean, who knows what happened to them? Maybe they got lost in a flood or a train derailment. Who knows? But you, as a seller, are responsible to communicate with me. And of course, we did PayPal Friends, which meant there was no recourse there for me to get a refund. So I ended up getting nothing for what I paid, which was very discouraging. And I, of course, with the wife situation, I stopped buying records back in late August. I really haven't bought hardly anything since. And kept waiting. These records never showed up. And I got really discouraged. And I got a gift last month from somebody. And so I decided to go out and see if I could try to find those records, especially the 4 Clef Norgran 10 inches that I was waiting for. They were important pieces, and they just needed to be filled in. And I found part of why I was so discouraged is 2 of these records always go for big money, and oftentimes they want more for just this one record than I paid for the bundled set. So I was like, I can't go out and pay that much for this one when I already bought them as a set and got them as got a great price. It just felt really ick. So yeah, it was discouraging, but I finally found 2 of the records which were always really expensive for decent prices. And I think I ended up paying roughly the same, as maybe even a little less than what I was paid for the Italian ones. I mean, I still paid for them twice. I never got the original purchases. But these are the 4 Clef Norgran 10 inches that I waited for a long time. This is a Bud Powell. I think it's from '51. This was initially a Mercury release, because if the early days of Clef Norgran, Norman Granz was leasing his recordings to the Mercury label, and they were issuing them. And he managed to get most of that stuff back and reissue it as Clef and Norgran stuff. But I believe it's a David Stowe Martin cover. It's one of my least favorite David Stowe Martin covers. But it's early Bud Powell. And Bud's still a very creative force at this point. And it's got Ray Brown on the bass and Max Roach on the drums. So a pretty all-star affair without any question. Bud's still pretty young, pretty vigorous. A lot of the mental hospital and the police abuse has not happened yet. And he records for Blue Note shortly after this, early, and then disappears for a little bit, comes back, does some more recordings. But you gotta love Bud Powell. He's truly one of the great players, most innovative players. A contemporary of Monk's, and probably as influential as Monk, a better bebop player than Monk was. And Monk, of course, was the progenitor of a lot of the avant-garde and a lot of dissonance and a lot of alternative things Monk is that precursor to. But Powell was definitely a fellow New York native and really entrenched in what Monk, they were kind of very much contemporaries and very much feeling off each other. And this, again, it was number 502, making, I think, the second Clef Mercury collaboration 10-inch. And the stuff that was on Mercury got the 500 sequence. And I think the stuff in the other sequence didn't have anything on Mercury, but I'm not even positive on that. Some of those might have had Mercury releases as well. The second title I got, this is Clef number 156. And this is the great Teddy Wilson. And the 100 series goes about 170, 175. So there's like 15 titles in the 500 sequence, 15 10 inches in the JATP series. And there's about 160 in this series. Sorry, no, about 75 in this series. Because there's no early, it starts at 100 or 101. But the great Teddy Wilson, what a beautiful session this is. Fantastic, beautiful vinyl. Teddy, of course, was sort of discovered by Benny Goodman, or brought to Benny Goodman's attention. And Benny Goodman, the king of swing, you know, the poor Jew from the south side of Chicago, who became the king of swing and became a very popular, very successful jazz impresario. I mean, he was really a leader in a lot of ways with jazz in white America. Because remember, these are still very divided times. So all the great black innovators were pretty unknown in white America, with few exceptions. Armstrong maybe had crossed over some, but most of your great black players were fairly anonymous. There was no, you got some radio broadcasts that would give you a little Basie, a little bit of Ellington, a bit, for the most part, you get some Ella Fitzgerald back when she was with Chick Webb and leading his band afterwards. But a lot of the black leaders and players were very obscure to white America. And we've since elevated a lot of them into a higher place of esteem. But they weren't popular household names and figures like the Benny Goodmans. And a lot of the great white, Gene Krupa was a huge star. You know, the Dorseys were huge stars. Paul Whiteman was a huge star. Glenn Miller. I mean, there's so many examples of these white orchestras doing black music, some better than others, that were massive entities selling millions of records. On some level, Elvising and Emineming black music, exploiting it and making it their own, doing it well with some integrity, but still it's a little gross on some level that they were having such success with another culture's music that culture itself was struggling to pay their bills. And black America was, of course, deep in poverty, struggling through the Depression, struggling through the war years. And so in the late 30s, Benny Goodman had Charlie Kirshner brought to his attention, the great guitar player from Oklahoma. He had Benny Goodman brought Teddy Wilson and Lionel Hampton to the stage, which Benny Goodman deserves all the credit in the world for doing this, because he took a great risk as a white American, even as a Jew, to acknowledge this black talent. That unequivocally he knew Teddy Wilson and Lionel Hampton were going to make his band swing harder. Lionel Hampton was no one had played the vibraphone like Lionel Hampton before Lionel. Teddy Wilson, his elegance, his sophistication, his chording, his choral sound. I mean, Teddy Wilson's one of the most beautiful players you'll ever hear. And even his later work on labels like Columbia are noteworthy and worth having. And most of his work on Verve is really beautiful stuff. But Goodman put them on the stage, and he ends up doing something even more risky. He ends up giving his audiences a set of them in trio and quartet form, along with Gene Krupa on the drums. So you go to see Goodman, and there's going to be this moment where two black men were kind of center stage in Hampton and Wilson. And Norman Granz was quick to sign up both of them, Hampton and Wilson. And as Goodman kind of slips into obscurity, Wilson and Hampton were both very influential people in the jazz community, probably made a decent living for black musicians. Hampton was one of the great band leaders and teachers and role models. I mean, a lot of people in jazz, especially the black musicians, talk about how important Lionel Hampton was and how he gave them their break, and being in his band was a very educational place for them to grow and learn. So kudos to Goodman, but also kudos to Norman Granz for re-signing these guys. And Teddy Wilson's records go for a steal. I mean, you can often get them for really next to nothing, and yet he's one of the most beautiful, most important players to ever play this art form. And like I said, even his Columbia stuff, being somewhat more commercial, is still noteworthy and really gorgeous. Now, two records that were really tough to find, and especially this one, Chico O'Farrell, Norgran number 9. The Norgran stuff came probably 54, 55. He launches that second title. Obviously, Norgran is short for Norman Granz. And it's funny because it actually says Clef Records there, which I don't think any of my other Norgrands say that, but it's definitely a Norgrand title and never had a Clef release. And the record, like I said, Norgrand clearly, but it's got the trumpeter on it, the second Afro-Cuban suite. And Norman Granz, as I said before, was a real progenitor of the Latin jazz wave that sweeps America in the early to mid 50s. Dizzy Gillespie was a big proponent of it, guys like Chano Pozo, and I mean, there's a whole layer of Cubans and Latin American players. And of course, Cuba was still open to America in the 50s. And so this wave of musicians from Havana came over and inflected jazz with a lot of that Latin sound and rhythm and pulse. And Chico O'Farrell was kind of at the fore of a lot of that. He ends up doing some work at Impulse later that's really noteworthy and fun, bigger arrangements and production. But even these records have fairly big ensembles and intricate percussion sections, and the first Afro-Cuban Jazz Suite, which I made earlier with Machido's band, Clef Number 505, this music doesn't make authenticity its primary aim. It is rather a free and personal conception of a well-known form of Afro-Cuban music, and which are usually treated in a different manner. It's beautiful stuff, and it's got a real urban feel, and you could still dance to it. You could, think I Love Lucy with a little bit of Sex in the City, a lot of that Afro-Cuban sound. It's really fun stuff. And then a second Chico Farrell. I think there's 4 Chico Farrell 10 inches altogether that get coupled on LPs later. Chico Farrell's Latino Dance Session. And there's 2 parts to this. One has a red cover, and this is the yellow cover. And so these 4 records were the 4 Clef Norgrand titles that I was supposed to get from Italy, and I've now replaced them. And like I said, I didn't do too bad on them, so it is what it is. 2 other things I found this one. I'm never able to find this for less than a couple $100. And I finally found one for 45. I offered the guy 40, and he took it. And I was like, wow, I couldn't believe it. And when I bought it, it's actually kind of mislabeled on Discogs. It makes it look like it's actually a 12-inch LP. And I was like, why would they have this version as a 12-inch LP? Because there's a second cover for the 12-inch LP. The 10-inch cover shouldn't exist on the 12-inch cover and have a different 12-inch cover as well. So I think it's actually a mistake on Discogs. This is the 10-inch version, the ideation of Kenny Drew, a great David Stone Martin cover, a very rare piece by a very young Kenny Drew. It's his second session recording as a leader. His first one was on Blue Note, and that's New Sounds or something like that with Kenny Drew. That's a great record as well. But this is a beautiful record, and I finally got a copy that I can dig my teeth into. Kenny Drew, or Eugene White and Lawrence Marble on the drums. Vinyl's in beautiful condition. Norgrand number 29, which I think makes it either the last or the second to last Norgrand 10-inch before we switch over to the LP era. And then most of the Norgrand Clef 10-inch stuff gets reissued in the first couple hundred Verve 8,000 releases, which I've documented all in past episodes before. But again, a really rare piece, and one I was really happy to plug in. Didn't really have the money at the time, but it's something I've waited for so long. I've been watching for so long on Discogs. When one finally came available that was in a price range I could really make a reach for, I decided to roll the dice on it. And again, my money's tight, but sometimes you just gotta roll that dice. And another piece I got the other day, and this is Norgrand number 24, and I have a Japanese 12-inch version of this 10-inch, which I was always suffice to say that's going to be all I need for now. If I get the 10-inch someday, maybe. But I found this for really cheap on eBay from a seller who probably wasn't a big jazz person. And it's the George Wallington 10-inch, the workshop of the George Wallington Trio. And again, it's Arthur Taylor on the drums and Curly Russell on the bass. Fantastic. Wallington's an Italian immigrant. He changed his name to Wallington because he was a guy of high fashion, And a lot of his kids in school were calling him Wellington because of how he dressed. And he just kind of adopted the name, which is a very British sounding name. Well, George Wellington. But he's actually an Italian immigrant. Raised up and brought in the New Jersey, New York area. Really talented, innovative player who was at the crux of a lot of what was happening in the 50s. A lot of his early mid-50s stuff on 10-inch is really hard to find and expensive. His progressive 10-inch goes for big bucks. He has some early work at Prestige that's quite noteworthy. I think he has some Savoy recordings that are really noteworthy. But this one, Norman Granz, I'd always kind of wanted to have the original 10-inch of that. And again, I got that for 20 bucks on eBay. And once in a while you find a seller who doesn't value or appreciate or know jazz. And that's something you have to always kind of look for. That comes with a risk because they might not know how to grade stuff. I mean, but I've said before, if you have a Kiss avatar on your record selling page, I want to see what you got for jazz records. Because chances are, if you love Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons, jazz was never something you dove too deeply into. And I'm stereotyping. I mean, there could be a huge jazz fan who loves Kiss as well. But I'm just saying, generally speaking, if you're in metal and that kind of stuff, you probably didn't cross into jazz too much. And maybe as a seller, you don't care about the jazz record you found and you give them away. And that's my experience. Is guys who come from a more hard rock background don't price jazz stuff or dig into it too deeply. 2 records I want to talk to you about again. I was talking with Mike from the Jazz Bums the other day, and he started to collect this series, which made me pull out these first 2 volumes, Clef 601 and Clef 602, which makes them the second and third Clef 12-inch titles. Only the only predecessor to this was a Gene Krupa session, 600. But these 2 jam session records, 601 and 602 on Clef, are beautiful sessions. And a great David Stone Martin cover. And I initially filed them under Ray Brown for not really knowing where else to file them, but they now are filed by label, of course, under 601 and 602 under the Clef imprint. So that Ray Brown, you can kind of just ignore that. But a great drawing of all the musicians on the record. And I want you to take for a second and just think about who we have assembled here. We have a rhythm section constituting the great Oscar Peterson at a very young age on the piano. And there's Oscar. A young J.C. Hurd on the drums. The great young, super talented Ray Brown on the bass. Barney Kessel, there he is with the glasses, on the guitar. So what a rhythm section you got already. Ray, Hurd, Oscar, and Barney Kessel. Forget about it, right? And then your horn section, it's really something to write home about. On the alto, you have 3 of the greatest alto players of all time. Charlie Parker. Forget about it. The great Benny Carter, who a lot of people today kind of overlook. And then the wonderful Johnny Hodges of Duke Ellington fame. So what an incredible alto section. Parker, Hodges, and Benny Carter. Wow. On tenor, you got the great Ben Webster, one of the greatest tenor players of all time. Then here's a bit of an anomaly. A young Flip Phillips, who was a white cat, and Norman Granz didn't really care about your race. He cared about could you play. And Flip gets a lot of work with the Jazz of the Philharmonic series. He gets quite a few recordings in the Clef and Norgran 10-inch series. And so Norman Granz obviously loved Flip Phillips a lot, and Flip's a really great player. And for him to be in this cast of characters tells you a lot about how great a player Flip Phillips is. And he's also a nice compliment to Ben Webster, tonality-wise. And then last but not least, the piece de la resistance. The guy has his back to the audience. And again, not a photograph, in a drawing, his back is to his face is to the back of us. And I'd like to know why David Stone Martin put him. Was there a record label contractual thing? I'm not really sure, because that trumpet player is the one and only, probably the most underrated trumpet player in jazz, the great Charlie Shavers, who I've espoused beatitudes about many times. Shavers is a beautiful player. He's lyrical. His tone is pure and crystal clean and emotive and rhythmically pulsing. And he's just a fun, flirtatious, lyrical. I mean, he's such an amazing player. Why is he so forgotten? It blows my mind at times how people don't recognize the talent and ability and beauty of the great Charlie Shavers. And he is really the guy on this cast of characters who raised my eyebrow and grabbed me by the throat. Charlie Shavers is all over this. And again, there are 2 sessions, 4 sides. Each side is pretty much a long jam, rooted in originals, not in standards. Boy, these guys are throwing down. And so you really need both of these to really sit back and really dig into and listen to each side a couple times and just really hear these players. One of the greatest bands ever assembled. And the Jazz at the Philharmonic stuff was incredible. But this sounds even better being recorded in the studio. Just these guys throwing down and emoting and talking about their day and telling stories through their horns. And that rhythm section just laying down that pulse. And I mean, this is hip hop at its genesis. This is a bunch of MCs assembled with a great rhythm track behind them, just expressing, telling stories, freestyling. It's the Wu-Tang Clan, circa 1953. It's one of the coolest sessions, and me and Mike were talking about it quite a bit, Parenti. And I think he's been diving into a lot of these. There's probably 9 volumes of the Norman Granz jam sessions, and the lineups change in later sessions. But these volumes 1 and 2, boy, if you want to get the essence of what jazz is, and the black gospel and the blues and the roots of this music and the expressive and emotive ability of these players to get their mind and their soul expunged through their art, this is high quality stuff. And I can't say enough about these 2 records. Again, David Stone Martin, Norman Granz, Parker Hodges. It's just Ben Webster. It's what an assemblage of talent. And Norman Granz could say to himself, today we're going to jam some stuff live in the studio, guys. This is who I want there. And no other label could come close to that stable of musicians, that pedigree of artists, that experience and wisdom. And the rhythm section, granted, is a young assemblage of guys. Peterson's a young Canadian. Ray Brown's a young guy here. Barney Kessel, of course, is a fairly young guy himself. Hurd's a young guy. But the other guys are all more senior circuit. They've been around a while. And, I mean, it's some of the best Parker stuff you'll hear. Hodges is always going to be Hodges. But again, it's really Charlie Shavers, whose back is to the camera in a drawing. Because I don't think for contractual reasons you can withhold someone's face in a drawing. I don't think, maybe. But I mean, a photograph, I could see, like, yeah, we're going to put it backwards so we don't have any issues with the label. But I don't know where Shavers would even have been at. He was at Bethlehem in 54, 55. But I think this probably predates his Bethlehem days. And they do show Shavers' face right there. But again, these are as good a jazz records as you'll ever hear and encounter. And I've really enjoyed digesting them and comprehending the skill and the ability and also Norman Granz's capacity to put this much talent into a room at one time. Me and Jean-Michel Reeser Beethoven were talking the other day, and we hadn't spoken in a while, so it was great to catch up with him. But he agrees that Shavers is really an unheralded figure that's worthy of so much more recognition. I mean, we love Dizzy Gillespie, we love Miles Davis, Roy Eldridge, but I mean, as a technician and as a beautiful expresser, I'll take Shavers over Miles or Roy Eldridge any time. And Dizzy was a wonderful, obviously, player with an incredible amount of chops and virtuosity. But and Dizzy can play ballads. He's a really beautiful balladeer. But really Shavers. And he's got that light of Armstrong as well, that brightness, that hint of joy that he's still surviving. Life hasn't destroyed me yet. It might try to hold me down. It might try to burden me, but fuck it. And if Shavers doesn't bring a smile to your face, you're not listening to jazz the right way. If you're just listening to jazz, put your monocle in so people can perceive you as being sophisticated, that's snobbery, elitism, and you're missing the beauty of this art. Because the black men that made and created this music, that was never their intent. But not, like, look at me how sophisticated. It's about, fuck, I gotta get this shit off my chest. This horn allows me to get some shit said. It's beautiful. It's powerful. It's inspiring. It's the stuff dreams are made of. So, again, if you want to support the channel, please either pledge to Patreon, hit me up in PayPal. I'm trying to keep this coffee shop going. And, of course, I live upstairs, so I need this building to reside in as well and to house my collection. If this business fails, I might end up losing my collection as well, which would be pretty devastating. So anybody who wants to support the channel, it would be definitely appreciated. The coffee shop as well. That being said, y'all have a great week. Thank you for watching and supporting this channel. Everybody who's donated anything to me in the last year and a half, 2 years, thank you so much. It's all been very valued and appreciated. And it's always gone to important things. Whether it's paying bills or buying a record I've been trying to find for a while, or catching up on my mortgage. It's just the essentials of life that being in small town America coming out of the pandemic, there's just a lot of issues that, and then of course my divorce with my wife has been, which is nowhere near finalized. We're not even filing divorce yet. We're still navigating the course of this river, trying to figure out where we're going to be. But it's been a lot. And her departure, of course, has really juxtaposed my money in a way where I got to cover a lot more things than I was supposed to. And it's made it so there's very little play money. But lucky for me, most of my play doesn't derive from having money. It derives from diving into my spirituality and listening to this music and hearing what this art has to say. And I'm a pretty content person without having money to spend. I need a little bit here and there. We all need a little gravy on our plate. But, I mean, money certainly isn't the focus and the intent of my life's being. And so I can survive without spending a lot of money. But sadly, you need a lot of money just to pay your bills in this country as inflation drives things up, and the cost of living and the cost of heating and the cost of gas and everything else. It's just gas in your car, it all just kind of compiles. I hit a deer last week and cost me again. You know, I mean, insurance might give me a little payout here, but I think my complicated situation. Anyway, I'll let you guys go. Have a great day. We'll talk to y'all soon. My name is Dan the Jack Shepherd. Peace.